She fed a black homeless man for years despite ridicule. But on her wedding day, something happened that no one expected. The sky filled with helicopters and her guests were left in shock. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. In the quiet town of Fairhaven, nestled between faded red hills and groves of slow-turning maples, the world stirred to life long before the sun dared peek over the rooftops. It was a town where time moved at a slower, sometimes suffocating pace, and where people smiled with their lips but watched with judgmental eyes. The streets were narrow and worn smooth by habit, and nothing new ever really happened there, unless you were willing to look closely. Every morning, at precisely 5 a.m., before the air turned warm and heavy with the scent of sugar and coffee, Grace Winters unlocked the side door of her father's bakery with a soft, metallic click. The Winters family bakery had been a fixture in town for over 40 years, passed from her grandfather to her father, and now in practice, though not yet officially, to Grace herself. The signage was faded but familiar, the windows always a little fogged from the ovens inside, and the smell, sweet yeast and butter, was enough to make locals nostalgic just by walking past. Grace was 28 years old, fair-haired and modest in style, with a soft voice and steady hands. There was nothing flashy about her. She wore simple clothes, didn't post her thoughts online, and never raised her voice, even when she had every right to. But inside her, like a slow-burning flame, lived something people often mistook for naivete. Grace called it conviction. While the bakery ovens warmed and the first light began to outline the horizon, Grace prepared her special package. It had become a ritual so deeply woven into her day that she didn't even think twice about it anymore. A sandwich, usually turkey and cheese, or peanut butter and jelly, something hearty. A piece of fruit, preferably an apple if they were in season. A small bottle of water, and finally, a paper napkin with a handwritten message. Today's note read, "You are not invisible. Someone sees you." She wrapped the sandwich in brown wax paper, placed the apple and water beside it, and gently folded the napkin on top like a seal. Then she placed it all in a plain brown bag and tucked the handles over her wrist. She moved quietly through the kitchen, nodding briefly to the early shift baker, who gave her the same disapproving glance he always did when he saw the bag. "Still feeding your pet ghost?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Grace ignored him, as she had for the past 18 months, and continued out the back door. The alley behind the bakery was clean, swept every Saturday morning by her own broom. Trash bins stood in a neat line near the brick wall, and across from them, on a slightly uneven bench that had once belonged to the town library, sat the man. He was always there, always in the same spot, always with the same hunched shoulders and slow, distant gaze. He never asked for anything, never spoke. He simply existed, still and silent in a world that seemed to pretend he wasn't there. He was an old black man, maybe late 60s or 70s, with deeply creased skin the color of mahogany. His clothes were tattered but clean in a way that suggested meticulous care, as if he were doing his best with what little he had. A battered duffel bag rested by his feet, its straps knotted with age and use. His boots were scuffed to near ruin, but always laced. Most days he wore a heavy military-style jacket, the kind with faded patches whose meaning had long since been rubbed away. Grace approached slowly, respectfully. She placed the bag beside him on the bench, just far enough to not crowd him. She didn't speak, and neither did he, but their eyes met just briefly, and in that quiet moment, something passed between them, a silent nod of acknowledgement, of recognition. And then she turned and walked away. Back in the kitchen, the other workers were already gossiping. One of the younger girls, Amanda, was recounting the morning's event to a new hire. "She's been doing that every day. For over a year," Amanda said, rolling her eyes. "Wasting good food on that old bum. Doesn't even say thank you." The new hire chuckled nervously, unsure of the tone he was supposed to adopt. "Maybe he's her secret lover," he joked, and the group burst into laughter. Grace pretended not to hear. She continued kneading the dough for cinnamon rolls, her hands working rhythmically, her shoulders tense but held steady. The comments no longer surprised her, but they still stung in the way paper cuts did, small, sharp, and irritating long after they occurred. Later that day, the bakery manager pulled her aside under the pretense of a performance review. He was kind, or at least practiced in appearing kind, and spoke in the slow, measured tones of someone delivering a warning in disguise. "We all admire your compassion, Grace. Truly. But some customers have mentioned feeling uncomfortable," he said, folding his hands. "It might be best, for the business, if we refrained from encouraging vagrancy near the premises." Grace listened, nodded politely, and gave no response. She had heard similar things from other people before, people who liked to package cruelty and civility, people who claimed discomfort as a shield for their own indifference. But she changed nothing. Instead, she started arriving 15 minutes earlier, when even the earliest employees hadn't yet clocked in. She left the food before anyone could see her, walked the alley while it was still blue with pre-dawn light. She made her kindness smaller, quieter, but not less. One afternoon, her mother stopped by the bakery with samples for the florist. She stayed to chat, which in her case meant whispering criticisms under the guise of concern. "I drove past this morning," she said, sipping her coffee. "Saw you out back again. Grace, it's not safe." "He never moves from the bench," Grace replied. "That's even worse. Could be sick, could be dangerous." "He's neither." "You don't know that." Grace didn't answer. Her mother was the kind of woman who donated to charity once a year and thought it made her a saint. She had been raised in the old way, manners before morality, image above substance. She'd never misspoke at a dinner table, but she'd cross the street at the sight of someone homeless. "That man," her mother added with a sigh, "is not your responsibility." But Grace felt differently. She didn't see a threat or a nuisance. She saw dignity masked by dirt, silence shaped by suffering, a man who had been erased from society so thoroughly that only one person still remembered to greet him with kindness. One particularly cold morning, she brought him a thick woolen scarf, the one her grandmother had knitted years ago. She hesitated only briefly before setting it beside the bag. He didn't touch it right away, but the next day he wore it wrapped carefully around his neck. She smiled when she saw it. He didn't smile back, but he nodded, and that was enough. Winter turned to spring. The town bloomed again. The bakery was busier. People came and went. New gossip replaced old. But Grace's routine remained unchanged. There were days when she doubted herself, when the weight of disapproval, of being different, pressed harder than usual. But then she would see the man, silent, patient, alive, and remember why she started in the first place. He was still there, still waiting. And she would still bring the food, because some people are not invisible. They are only unseen. And Grace Winters had never believed in pretending. The days grew longer as winter slowly unfurled into spring. The heavy winds lost their bite, and the sky, once a muted gray canvas, began brushing hints of blue along the horizon. In the town of Fairhaven, people emerged from behind closed doors like bears stirring from hibernation, eager to plant flowers, mow their lawns, and pretend they hadn't spent the colder months watching their neighbors too closely. Life resumed with an artificial cheer, and with it came new distractions. Church fairs, weekend markets, rumors of someone getting divorced or arrested, depending on who told the story. For Grace Winters, the changing season brought no change in rhythm. The days may have brightened, the air sweetened with blossoms, but her morning routine remained precisely the same. Before the sun rose, before the ovens were fully warm, before the town stretched its collective arms in a yawn, Grace walked to the back alley, brown bag in hand, and laid it gently on the bench beside the man who had come to occupy a quiet space in her life. There was something sacred about those few minutes each morning. The silence. The way the cold still clung to the concrete before the first rays of sunlight began to lift it. The way she could hear birds and her own heartbeat, unbothered by traffic or the constant hum of other people. It was in that silence that she found clarity, and in the company of a man who rarely spoke, she felt oddly understood. Their interaction never changed. She placed the food, their eyes met, and she turned to go. But something had shifted between them, something intangible. It was in the way he nodded now, slower, deeper. In the way he reached for the bag, not with haste or desperation, but with care, as though acknowledging its meaning went beyond the contents. One morning, when the wind was still sharp and a thin layer of frost traced the edges of the bench, Grace found something new waiting for her. It was subtle, so easy to miss that she almost walked past it. Nestled beneath the corner of the bench, nearly hidden in shadow, was a folded napkin. At first, she thought it had simply blown there by accident, but then she saw her own handwriting faintly peeking out. It was one of the napkins she had written a message on days earlier. She bent down, heart already stirring with confusion and curiosity. Unfolding it, she discovered a single sentence scrawled in an uneven, shaky script, as though the writer had not held a pen in a long time. "Thank you for seeing me." She stood for a long moment, the napkin in her hand, the air unmoving. The words were few, but the weight of them settled heavily in her chest. It wasn't a grand gesture or a flowery speech. It was an acknowledgement, a breaking of silence that she had never asked for but always hoped might come. Back in the bakery, she tucked the napkin into her wallet like a prayer. It stayed there, flat and folded, between old receipts and loyalty cards, a quiet talisman that she returned to more often than she liked to admit. Whenever someone muttered something cruel, or her own doubt crept in, she would feel the edge of the paper and remember, he saw her too. She began to notice more subtle things. The scarf she had left for him, a deep navy woolen one knitted by her grandmother, was now wrapped neatly around his neck most mornings. On especially cold days, he pulled it high up under his chin. Some days, the food remained untouched for hours, and Grace worried. But it was always gone by mid-morning, and that, she learned, was his way of saying he was still there. Inside the bakery, however, the temperature had begun to change. The whispers, once sporadic and hushed, grew louder with repetition. A few regulars began mentioning that man behind the building, complaining that his presence was bad for business. Amanda, the younger assistant, delighted in playing the role of informant. "She's still feeding that homeless guy," she told a customer one day, shaking her head with a pitying sigh. "Every single morning, like clockwork. Probably thinks she's some kind of angel." The customer scoffed, amused and irritated. "Poor thing. thinking she's making a difference. Grace had heard the words. She'd been standing not far from them, rolling dough on the prep table. She said nothing, didn't even glance their way, but her grip on the rolling pin had tightened until her knuckles turned white. It wasn't that the judgment hurt, she was used to that by now, but the dismissiveness, the casual cruelty, cut deep. These people saw her acts of kindness as delusion, not grace. They reduced a man to a cautionary tale, a dirty inconvenience to be ignored or mocked. She wanted to scream, to shake them and say, "He is someone. He matters." But she didn't. She continued her work, steady and precise, letting her actions speak where words would only scatter in the wind. When she told her mother what had happened, hoping perhaps for support, she was met with disapproval instead. "You're too soft-hearted," her mother said, sipping her tea. "Always picking up strays, always giving away what you've earned." Grace stared at the steam curling from her own mug. "He never asked me for anything." "All the more reason to be wary. You don't know what kind of man he is. You don't know what he's done." "I don't care." "You should." The conversation ended there, suspended in silence, each woman withdrawn into her own stubbornness. Her mother could not understand, would never understand, and Grace had long given up trying to make her. Tom, her fiancé, was gentler about it, though just as uncertain. He didn't object outright, but he would ask questions that hinted at discomfort. "Does he ever talk to you?" he'd ask. "No," Grace would reply. "And you're okay with that?" "I am." He would nod slowly, unconvinced but unwilling to argue. Tom was pragmatic, shaped by logic and data, not emotion. He saw her kindness as admirable in theory but impractical in application. And Grace understood his hesitation, even forgave it, but knew he was missing something fundamental, the way it felt to look into the eyes of someone the world had forgotten and say, "I see you." On a rainy morning in April, the kind that soaked the sidewalks and curled the pages of newspapers, Grace found the man shivering beneath a thin poncho. His duffel bag was tucked under him for insulation, but it was clearly not enough. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the food, and for the first time, Grace hesitated before walking away. She returned 5 minutes later with a thermos of hot coffee and her own woolen scarf. She'd worn it for years, a deep green gift from her sister during a Christmas they barely got through. Without saying a word, she draped it over his shoulders, placed the thermos beside him, and retreated into the bakery. The next morning, he wore the scarf. And the morning after that. It became part of his uniform, part of their ritual. From that point on, Grace no longer wondered if what she was doing mattered. She knew. It wasn't about rescue or transformation or glory. It was about presence, about reminding another human being every day that he was not forgotten. She never asked his name. He never offered it. But they knew each other more honestly than most people who shared dinner tables. Spring turned into early summer. The town grew busier. New hires came and went. The gossip shifted to wedding preparations and high school graduations. But behind the bakery, on that weathered bench beside the trash bins, the man still waited, and Grace still brought him food. One morning, a coworker passing by muttered, "He'll take advantage of her kindness one day." But Grace no longer flinched, because the truth was simple. He never had, and he never would. By the time summer deepened into its golden heights, the town of Fairhaven had folded itself into a lull of weddings, barbecues, and baby showers. The local church bulletin was filled with announcements of unions and engagements, all carefully adorned with pastel borders and cursive script. In the center of it all, Grace Winters found herself included in the current of public expectation. She had said yes to Thomas Riley, and with that one syllable, her life tilted toward ceremony. Tom, steady and thoughtful, was not the sort to overwhelm. He asked Grace to marry him during a walk along the lake they had visited on their third date, his words quiet and unsure. She had not cried, but she had nodded, her eyes gentle with surprise. He had taken her hand, and together they watched ducks ripple across the still water without another word. That was their way, peaceful, reserved, built not on passion but a kind of patient compatibility. Now, months later, their wedding was just weeks away. The invitations had gone out. The catering was finalized. The venue, a sprawling garden attached to a historic manor, had been paid for in full by Tom's parents, who took great pride in tasteful traditions and good wine. Grace found herself drifting between floral arrangements and dress fittings, trying to hold her center amid the whirl of white and silver and expectations. From the outside, it all looked perfect. Grace had what many considered an ideal life, a kind fiancé, a growing role in the family business, a respected name in the community. But beneath the smooth surface, a subtle disquiet had begun to stir. She felt it in quiet moments when Tom talked about seating charts, and she found herself thinking of the man behind the bakery instead. She felt it when her mother spoke about the guest list in tones that implied who belonged and who did not. She felt it most keenly when she walked to the back alley each morning and saw him still sitting there, unmoving, unwavering, and entirely uninvited. She never told Tom about the note, the one on the napkin, or the scarf, or the fact that she had begun to recognize the man's rhythm more deeply than some of her own relatives. Tom knew about the homeless man, of course. He knew she brought food, but he didn't know the shape of their unspoken bond. He didn't understand that for Grace this ritual had become more than an act of kindness. It was a thread in her life's fabric, quiet and strong, holding parts of her together. One afternoon, as she sat with her wedding planner reviewing table settings, a strange heaviness settled on her chest. The planner, a brisk woman named Meredith, who had organized 3 generations of weddings in Fairhaven, had just asked her to confirm the guest count. Grace paused, her pen hovering over the list. There, in the margins of her thoughts, he lingered. The man whose name she still didn't know. The man who had never asked for anything, yet who had received her most consistent devotion. "Grace?" Meredith prompted. She blinked. "Sorry. Yes, the list is fine." But it wasn't. That night, after Tom had gone home and the bakery had closed, Grace sat alone at her kitchen table with a stack of envelopes and a cup of tea gone cold. Her fingers traced the edge of a blank invitation, the heavy cardstock smooth beneath her touch. She stared at it for a long time, wrestling with something deeper than etiquette. What would it mean to invite him? Would he even come? Would it embarrass Tom? Would her family understand? No, they wouldn't, but she wrote it anyway. There was no full name to address it to, no mail-in address, just a simple message in her slanted, careful handwriting. "You are welcome at my wedding. It would mean a great deal to see you there. Grace." She placed it in a plain envelope, unsealed, and the next morning tucked it beneath the brown bag of food she left on the bench. She did not expect anything. She did not even expect it to be opened. She merely needed to offer the invitation, needed to make the gesture, even if it went unnoticed. It felt necessary, like finishing a sentence she'd been writing for 2 years. The days that followed moved quickly, each one consumed by some new detail. Her mother was consumed by the guest list, reviewing it obsessively, crossing out names she deemed too distant or too embarrassing. When Grace mentioned inviting a few of her coworkers, her mother's mouth twisted. "You mean those girls at the bakery? Honestly, darling, they don't exactly fit the tone we're trying to set." Grace didn't reply. She had long since stopped expecting her mother to say anything that wasn't laced with judgment. Tom, for his part, was supportive in that absent-minded way that often came with men unaccustomed to emotional complexities. He asked if she was excited, and she said yes. He asked if she needed help, and she said no. He did not notice that her eyes drifted during these conversations, that her replies were quieter than usual. One evening, while folding programs at her kitchen table, Grace overheard a story on the radio. A veteran had been found living under a bridge in a nearby city. He had served in Iraq. He had once received a medal for valor. Now he ate out of dumpsters. Grace listened, unmoving, her hands still on the paper in her lap. She wondered, not for the first time, who the man behind her bakery had once been. He wore a jacket that looked like it had seen combat. He sat like someone used to stand and watch. There were mornings when his back was impossibly straight, his gaze fixed far beyond the alley walls. He never asked for anything. Not food, not money, not pity. He had dignity, even in silence. She thought again of the napkin, the careful handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me." Would he come? The thought returned again and again. It flickered through her mind during the final fitting of her dress, during the rehearsal dinner, even during the last conversation she had with Tom before the ceremony. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and golden. Grace rose before the sun, as she always did. Her bridal suite overlooked the garden where the ceremony would take place, a wide, blooming expanse lined with white chairs and archways wrapped in ivy. Everything was as it should be. Everything looked perfect. And yet, as she stared out the window, watching the staff make final adjustments, her eyes drifted beyond the decorations, beyond the guests arriving in pastels and pearls. She looked toward the entrance of the estate. And then she saw him. He stood alone, near the edge of the gravel path, dressed in a clean, though clearly aged suit. The jacket was pressed, his boots were polished. The scarf she had given him months ago was folded carefully around his neck. He held nothing in his hands, no bag, no card. He was simply there, upright and silent, with the same stillness he brought to the alley bench. Grace felt the world tilt gently on its axis. Somewhere behind her, her mother was complaining about champagne flutes. Her bridesmaids were applying makeup, talking about photos, but Grace no longer heard them. She looked at him, he looked at her, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. She knew then, knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he had come not for food, not out of obligation, but because he understood. Because he, too, had been writing a sentence these past 2 years, and now, finally, he was ready to finish it. Grace stepped away from the mirror, her dress swaying softly around her ankles. She would meet him, and she would walk with him into a space where people had already begun to judge. But she was no longer afraid, because what they were about to witness was not just a wedding. It was the arrival of truth. The chatter outside had reached a crescendo. Laughter, heels clicking on the stone walkway, bursts of camera flashes, all the rituals of a wedding gathering were in full swing. Grace, peering out from behind the veil of a gauzy curtain in the bridal suite, could see the guests flooding into the garden below. They moved in choreographed swirls of pastel fabrics and navy suits, each of them grasping glasses of champagne, greeting cousins, uncles, and colleagues with the polished ease of people used to dressing up and being seen. But she did not search for familiar faces. Her gaze was fixed on the figure standing still near the stone gate at the edge of the grounds. Even from a distance, he looked like a different man, transformed not by wealth or posture, but by quiet intention. The suit he wore was dated, its seams softened with age, but it had clearly been pressed with care. The scarf she had once left for him, green wool, still a bit threadbare at the edges, was folded neatly over the lapel. His boots, though old, had been polished to a respectful gleam. Grace stared down at him, heart clenched and rising all at once, her breath caught not with fear, but with something heavier. It was happening. He had come. He had chosen to cross the invisible line the world had drawn around him, and he had done it alone, with no fanfare, no preparation beyond a clean collar and a steady walk. From behind her, the bridal suite murmured with activity. Bridesmaids snapped selfies. The makeup artist adjusted lip gloss. Her mother's voice pierced the air, sharp with logistical worry. I told them I wanted the chairs exactly aligned. Exactly, not roughly. And what's with the centerpieces? Who gave clearance for dahlias? The wedding planner whispered apologies and disappeared again. Grace stood still, her hand pressed against the cool glass, eyes still on the man by the gate. Her mother hadn't seen him yet. Neither had the guests. He took a step forward. Grace moved instinctively, gathering the hem of her gown, the satin brushing her ankles. She turned without a word and walked toward the door. One of her bridesmaids reached out to stop her, confusion flickering across her face. "Grace, where are you?" But Grace was already gone, her train sweeping behind her like a whisper of rebellion. Down the hall, through the kitchen corridor of the manor house, and out onto the gravel path that led to the edge of the lawn, she moved without hesitation. The guests hadn't noticed her yet. The musicians were tuning their instruments, and the ushers were checking lists and directing people to their seats. Only a few heads turned as she emerged into the open, her veil fluttering slightly in the breeze, her bouquet forgotten in the bridal suite. She walked straight toward him. He stood a few steps past the entrance arch, hands at his sides, back straight. As she approached, his face tilted up, and their eyes met once more. No words passed between them. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Grace reached him. Without pause, without the tremble she'd feared would betray her, she extended her hand. He looked down at it. Then he took it. Together they turned, and in that moment the murmurs began. A woman near the front row gasped audibly. Someone else hissed a startled breath. A cousin of Tom's leaned toward his wife, whispering with eyebrows raised. "Is she walking in with... Who is that man?" "I think he's homeless. I've seen him around." "Wait, is she friends with him? You're kidding." "Oh my God, she invited a bum to her wedding?" Grace heard every word. Not clearly, but sharply enough to know their meaning. The words didn't surprise her. They didn't even sting the way she had once feared they might. What struck her instead was how loud the disapproval was, not in volume, but in force. Like the ripples of a stone dropped in a shallow pool, the presence of a man who had done nothing but exist shattered the illusion of perfection these people had curated so carefully. Her mother, now standing near the front row, stared in horror. "Grace," she mouthed, her voice lost in the hum of disbelief. "What are you doing?" But Grace didn't stop. They moved slowly, not as a bride and father figure, nor as spectacle and scandal, but as two human beings who had once met over a paper bag in a silent morning and now stood in the middle of a ceremony that was no longer just about flowers and vows. She felt his hand tremble once, just slightly, and squeezed gently. By the time they reached the aisle, the silence was nearly complete. Even the musicians had stopped. Tom stood beneath the arch at the far end, his face unreadable. The officiant, a kind-faced woman with decades of weddings behind her, stood quietly, waiting. And then, just as the wind picked up, just as the moment stretched too thin to hold, a sound broke the stillness. It started low, barely more than a distant rumble. Then came the thudding of helicopter blades. At first, everyone looked skyward in confusion. Even Grace turned her head. Over the treetops, 3 helicopters emerged, dark and deliberate, slicing through the sky with military precision. They hovered for a breathless second before beginning their descent. From the opposite side of the grounds, a procession of black SUVs pulled into view, tires crunching against gravel. Guests stood. Some covered their mouths. Her mother staggered back a step, grabbing the arm of her friend. "What is this?" someone whispered. "What the hell is going on?" The SUVs stopped. Out stepped men and women in crisp navy dress uniforms, each adorned with medals, ribbons, shining buttons, each perfectly aligned. At their lead was a general, silver hair, square shoulders, face carved from experience. The musicians, without direction, began playing the national anthem. It was not part of the ceremony program. The honor guard marched toward the gathered guests and formed 2 symmetrical lines down the center aisle. The general stepped forward, saluted, and turned toward Grace and the man standing beside her. He lifted a microphone, one of the ones intended for the reception speeches. His voice, when it came, was steady and amplified over the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing, "before this ceremony continues, we ask your attention, because today you almost turned your backs on a man who should never have to walk alone again." He turned slightly, extending his hand toward the man beside Grace. "This is Colonel Jonathan Elijah Brooks, recipient of the Silver Star, veteran of 3 combat deployments. He saved the lives of 23 men during an ambush in Afghanistan. After losing his family in a house fire upon his return, he withdrew from public life. He refused awards, interviews, retirement honors. He disappeared, but he did not die. He lived quietly, alone, until one woman saw him. Now he faced Grace, one woman who asked no questions, demanded no explanations. She brought him food. She brought him dignity, every day, for years, without knowing who he was, without asking why he sat there. Gasps, murmurs, audible sobs from the crowd. A woman in the second row burst into tears. The general continued. "The United States National Guard owes a debt of honor to Colonel Brooks, but today we honor not only him, but the civilian who restored his faith in people. Miss Grace Winters." An officer stepped forward and placed a medal in the general's hand. He extended it to Grace. She did not reach for it. Instead, she turned to the man who still held her hand and stepped aside. With slow, shaking fingers, he took the medal and lifted it. Then, in a gesture that silenced even the birds above, he pinned it not to his chest, but to the edge of her wedding gown. The general saluted. The honor guard followed. All around them, guests sat frozen, overwhelmed by the sheer gravity of the moment. What had begun as a ceremony of tradition and beauty had become something else entirely. It had become truth. It had become redemption. And it was not finished yet. The garden stood suspended in a silence more profound than any words could have commanded. The colors of the wedding, white linens, soft lavender flowers, the blush tones of bridesmaids' dresses, seemed dulled now beneath the stark presence of navy uniforms, shining medals, and the pale blue flag of the National Guard that fluttered in the breeze like the punctuation at the end of a forgotten sentence. Grace stood still, not as a bride overcome with nerves, but as a woman stripped bare before a gathering of polite society now visibly shaken. She looked out across the rows of seated guests, some of whom had not yet reclaimed their seats. Faces, once smug and indifferent, now appeared reddened with embarrassment or pale with disbelief. Her mother, still standing, clutched her handbag with the rigidity of someone holding onto a vanishing illusion. Tom's father sat hunched over slightly, staring not at Grace or the uniformed honor guard, but at the gravel between his polished shoes. The moment had divided the gathering like a knife through silk. At Grace's side, Colonel Jonathan Brooks adjusted the lapel of his aged coat, the edges of which caught a glimmer of afternoon sunlight. He still said nothing. There was no need. The general had already spoken more truth than most had ever dared consider. In revealing the identity of the man they had scoffed at, dismissed as a stray, a danger, an eyesore, the National Guard had undone years of whispered bigotry and turned a wedding into a reckoning. The general stepped back, offering the floor once more to the couple. The officiant, who had watched everything unfold without moving from her place beneath the ivy-covered arch, lifted her eyes to Grace, waiting for instruction. But Grace wasn't ready yet, not until the last part was finished. She turned toward the man beside her and searched his face. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes had. They weren't distant anymore. They weren't hiding. They were calm, steady, and filled with a quiet weight that only decades of carrying others could give a man. She gently released his hand. The sound of shifting gravel broke the silence. Tom stepped forward. Until now, he had remained unmoving, unsure of how to react to the spectacle overtaking what was supposed to be his wedding. But now, something in his stance softened. He didn't look at the crowd or the soldiers. He looked only at Grace, then at the man she had brought into their ceremony without asking anyone's permission. He approached slowly, extending his hand toward the colonel. "Sir," he said, his voice low, uncertain, but sincere, "it would be an honor if you would walk her down the aisle." The colonel blinked once, then gave the smallest nod. He did not take the offered hand, but he placed his own, weathered, large, deliberate, on Grace's arm once more. They began walking. This time the guests did not whisper. No one shifted in their seats. The silence was reverent now, not stunned. Each step they took resounded louder than music. At the front, Tom waited, his posture more open than it had been only moments earlier. Grace reached him and gently passed her hand into his. The officiant cleared her throat and began again. Her voice, practiced and smooth, was tempered now with the weight of the preceding events. She read the words with less ceremony and more meaning, sensing perhaps that this wedding had become something far more than a union of two lives. As she moved through the beginning of the vows, the colonel turned to leave quietly, not wanting to intrude on what remained of the formalities. But before he could step away, another figure emerged from the line of uniformed officers. It was a man in his 40s, tall and clean-cut, wearing the insignia of a captain. His name tag read Wallace. He stepped forward and saluted the colonel sharply before turning to the audience. "I served with Colonel Brooks," he announced, his voice stronger than the general's had been. "He carried me out of a firefight in Fallujah when I couldn't move my legs. I would have bled out in a ditch if it weren't for him. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for backup. He just came back for me, again and again. He reached into the pocket of his dress uniform and produced a weathered photograph encased in plastic. In it, a younger Brooks was shown carrying a bloodied soldier over his shoulders, smoke curling in the background. The image, grainy and harsh, drew a collective breath from the crowd. Wallace continued. He never claimed his Silver Star, never went to the ceremony. He just vanished. We searched. No one could find him. Until now. And it took this woman, he gestured toward Grace, to bring him back. Grace felt her chest tighten. She had not expected this. She hadn't known he was decorated. Hadn't known he had once saved so many lives. To her, he had only ever been the man who sat by the dumpster and ate in silence. The man who once left her a napkin with a trembling message. "Thank you for seeing me." The captain turned to her. "You never knew who he was. And that's what makes this different. You didn't treat him well because of his rank. You treated him like a human being when no one else did." For the first time since the ceremony had begun, Grace's eyes filled. She had fought them back through everything, the whispers, the stares, the spectacle. But now, finally, the weight cracked her. She blinked and the tears slipped down her cheeks in quiet acknowledgement of something too vast for language. She reached out and took the colonel's hand again. He looked at her with the faintest shadow of a smile, and together they stood before the rows of guests who had, only an hour before, dismissed him with curled lips and side glances. The captain returned to the line of soldiers, and the ceremony resumed. When the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, when the final words were said and the couple declared husband and wife, the garden filled once again with music. But it was not the joyful, swelling type played to cue cheers. It was quieter, more solemn, a military hymn played on string instruments. The kind of song that pays tribute not to beauty, but to sacrifice. As the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, they passed through a corridor of uniforms, each soldier saluting them, one by one. Tom held Grace's hand tightly. He did not speak, but when they reached the end of the row and turned toward the reception tent, he leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for being exactly who you are." Later, under the canopy of white cloth and twinkling lights, the reception resumed, though the mood was changed. The toasts were shorter, less self-congratulatory. The laughter, when it came, was gentler. Guests approached Grace in small groups, offering quiet apologies or heartfelt praise. Some simply nodded with shame on their faces. The colonel did not stay long. After one small plate of food, handed to him by Grace herself, he excused himself. She walked with him back to the edge of the garden, away from the lingering stares. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I didn't know any of it." "You weren't supposed to," he replied. "I didn't want you to." "Why?" "Because I wasn't trying to be saved." She hesitated. "Then why did you come?" He looked at her, the shadows deep around his eyes, the lines carved by pain and silence and years of unspoken grief. "I came to repay a debt," he said. "One I didn't know I had until you paid it first." She nodded. There was nothing else to say. He turned, adjusted the scarf once more, and walked down the gravel path, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. The rest of the evening played out in softer tones. The guests danced, but not with abandon. The cake was cut, but without the choreographed flourish. Grace and Tom moved among their guests not as hosts, but as witnesses to something larger than celebration. At the end of the night, as the last song faded and the lights dimmed, Grace sat alone for a moment on the edge of the dance floor. Her dress was wrinkled. Her hair had begun to fall, but she felt no less a bride than she had hours before. In her lap, she held the medal the colonel had pinned to her gown. She had unfastened it during dinner, unable to wear its weight any longer, but she had kept it close. It gleamed faintly beneath the fairy lights, not polished, not new, but radiant in its truth. Somewhere, a man who once sat behind her bakery bench walked again among people who knew his name. And for the first time in years, he had been seen. The first light of dawn crept through the sheer white curtains of the manor's guest quarters. Outside, the remains of the previous night's celebration were scattered across the lawns like breadcrumbs after a feast. A napkin drifted slowly over the dewy grass, catching on the leg of a folding chair still left beneath the reception canopy. The scent of peonies and burnt wax lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the clean sweetness of wet earth. The wedding was over, but the weight of it had not yet settled. It hovered like fog, like a story still being written in the quiet aftermath of its most important chapter. Inside, Grace sat curled on a velvet settee, her wedding dress draped carefully across the back of a nearby chair. She wore a pale cotton robe now, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her bare feet tucked beneath her. Her hair, undone and tangled, fell around her face in soft waves. In her hands she held the medal, cool, heavy, oddly out of place among the pastel details of the bridal suite. She turned it slowly between her fingers, watching the way the morning light caught on the ridges of its engraving. She hadn't slept, not because of nerves or celebration, but because her mind would not settle. Her thoughts returned again and again to the moment when Colonel Brooks placed the medal on her gown. It had not been a performance. It had not been for the cameras or the crowd. It had been real, tactile, the quiet climax of 1,000 quiet mornings. It was the answer to a question she had never dared ask. Had it mattered? She thought back to the moment he first took her hand, before the march to the altar. There had been a tremble, just the faintest hesitation, as if he too had feared how the crowd would respond. But she had gripped him firmly, not because she needed support, but because she was given it. In that moment, their roles had shifted and yet remained the same. Two people, misunderstood by the world, walking a path others had long tried to block. The ceremony itself, though no longer a blur, lived in her memory like a dream. She remembered the faces, some struck dumb, some stricken with awe. Her mother's rigid posture collapsing into something that looked dangerously close to self-reflection. Tom's steady eyes, wide at first, then calm as they had always been, watching her approach with something new behind them. Understanding. Grace hadn't expected Tom to offer his place beside her to Colonel Brooks. She hadn't even hoped. And yet, he had done so without prompting, without show. It was a gesture that had altered something inside her, not just admiration, but belief. Perhaps Tom didn't understand the world the way she did. Perhaps he never would. But in that moment, he had trusted her enough to give space to what he did not yet comprehend. And that, more than any vow, had made her believe in what they were about to build together. Later, after the ceremony, while guests mingled beneath string lights and waiters circled with trays of canapes and flutes of champagne, she had walked with Colonel Brooks to the edge of the garden. The reception continued behind them, music softening with each step away. When they reached the gravel path near the gate, the colonel paused. He did not speak right away. Instead, he looked up at the sky, as if searching for something just beyond the clouds. The scarf she had given him, now faded at the edges, still rested on his shoulders. "You never asked who I was," he finally said, his voice low, deliberate. "I didn't need to," she replied. He nodded once, the gesture slow and deliberate, filled with meaning. They had stood like that for a long time. Two silhouettes framed by the last orange streaks of dusk. She hadn't needed answers. He hadn't needed praise. What had passed between them was not closure, but continuation. A different kind of beginning, one shaped by mutual regard and the unspoken truth that kindness, once extended, never disappears. It roots itself. It grows in the silence left by all the things we choose not to say. Now, in the quiet of the morning after, Grace rose from the settee and placed the medal gently on her bedside table. She moved to the window and opened it, letting the breeze carry away the stale air of yesterday. The garden below was still. The chairs had been cleared, the altar dismantled. Only the arch remained, its ivy curling slightly in the early light, a monument to a ceremony no one would soon forget. Downstairs, the house stirred. Staff members moved with the practiced quiet of professionals cleaning up after an event. Tom's voice drifted faintly up the staircase, speaking with one of the groomsmen. Grace smiled at the sound. It was odd, this new calm. Not the absence of tension, but the settling of it. She felt it in her chest, a warmth, not unlike the feeling of stepping into sunlight after standing too long in shadow. When she joined Tom for breakfast an hour later, he was seated at the long oak table in the Manor's sunroom, sipping black coffee and reading over a folded page. He looked up as she entered and stood instinctively. "You okay?" he asked, searching her face. She nodded. "Just thinking." He reached for her hand and guided her to the chair beside him. "About him?" "Yes," she said, then after a pause, "about all of it." Tom pushed the paper toward her. It was a printed photo, one of the official shots taken by the wedding photographer. In it, she stood beneath the arch, her hand tucked into the colonel's arm, both of them facing forward with the honor guard flanking either side. She hadn't seen this one before. It was framed perfectly, solemn and radiant. An image not of scandal, but of ceremony, of reverence. "They sent this early this morning," Tom said. "The photographer said he'd never captured anything like it." Grace studied the photo in silence. Then she folded it gently and placed it in her lap. "I want to do something," she said. He waited. "Not just one lunch a day. Something larger." He tilted his head. "Like a shelter?" "No," she said. "Not quite. I don't want to rescue anyone. I just want to create a space where no one has to earn dignity. A place like that bench behind the bakery, but warmer, safer." He didn't speak right away. She could see him thinking. Her practical husband, always weighing options, always looking for the path that could hold steady under pressure. Finally, he smiled. "Then we'll build it," he said. "Whatever it is." That evening, as they packed the last of their things and prepared to leave the manor for their brief honeymoon, a modest cabin in the woods, chosen by Grace for its silence, she returned once more to the garden. The arch still stood. She walked beneath it, the grass soft beneath her flats, and stood exactly where she had the day before. She closed her eyes and listened, not for applause or music, but for memory. For the hush of a crowd silenced by truth. For the voice of a general revealing a life once discarded. For the footsteps of a man once seen only as a burden. She opened her eyes and stepped forward. There was no one there now. No guests, no honor guard, no whispers. But she walked anyway. Down the aisle once more, alone this time, and in doing so, she felt the world shift again, just slightly, toward Grace. The sky over Fairhaven was a softer blue now, as if the weight of the summer heat had finally loosened its grip and left behind something lighter, more forgiving. The town, like Grace herself, had begun to breathe differently. There was still gossip in the bakery, still small-town politics in every glance exchanged at the post office or market. But something had shifted, subtly yet irrevocably. People paused longer when they spoke to her. Some apologized in passing. Others brought up the wedding awkwardly, fumbling with words as if trying to rewrite their own memories of that day. Grace never corrected them. She didn't need to. The truth had already done that. After the wedding, Grace and Tom had driven north into the quiet hills of Vermont, where a cabin with creaking floors and a sloping roof waited for them beside a lake. For 4 days, they slept late and rose early. They walked hand in hand along trails that smelled of pine and cool water. They sat in silence beside the fireplace, eating soup from mismatched bowls and speaking of things that felt bigger than ceremony and rings. It wasn't the honeymoon most of their friends expected, but it was the one they needed. They didn't talk about the Colonel much, not directly, but his presence lingered in every conversation about the future, in every quiet discussion about what they could build beyond their home and marriage. Grace felt no need to explain the depth of what had passed between them. Tom understood in his own quiet way, which was enough. Upon returning to Fairhaven, Grace did not go back to the bakery, not right away. She had left a letter for her father before the wedding, thanking him for the years of support, but explaining gently that she needed to do something different now, something she couldn't yet name. He hadn't called, he hadn't written, but he had left a single envelope on her doorstep 2 days after her return. Inside was a copy of the bakery's financial ledger and a handwritten note. You always saw what others wouldn't. Don't stop. Grace read the note twice, then folded it beside the one she still carried in her wallet. Thank you for seeing me. 2 sentences from 2 very different men, each affirming what she had known all along. That vision was not about eyes, but about heart. In the weeks that followed, she and Tom began the work of creation. They called it the Quiet Table. Not a shelter, not a soup kitchen, but something simpler. A space with no forms to fill, no names to give. Just a row of tables and chairs beneath an open awning where anyone could sit and be served a warm meal without question or condition. They rented a vacant lot near the edge of town, not far from the community center. The land was dusty and forgotten, framed by a rusted fence and overgrown weeds. But Grace saw potential in its openness. With help from Tom's co-workers, they cleared the space and built a structure with reclaimed wood and donated supplies. It wasn't polished or professional, but it was honest, clean, warm. The first day they opened, they served 12 people, mostly older men, 2 women and 1 young girl with a shy smile and dirt on her knees. Grace prepared the food herself, chili, cornbread, fruit. She wore no apron, no badge, only the same quiet conviction she had carried with her each morning behind the bakery. Word spread slowly but steadily. Veterans appeared first, drawn perhaps by whispers or the scent of coffee, or maybe just curiosity. Some spoke, some didn't. None were turned away. Grace kept her head down and her heart open. She never asked for stories, but sometimes they came anyway. A man with scars along his jaw told her about the time he carried a friend through gunfire. A woman with hollow eyes once whispered that she had been a nurse in Fallujah. Grace listened without judgment, without interruption. She gave them food and space and silence, which, more often than not, meant more than any response. The Colonel never came. Not once. But every month, like clockwork, a postcard arrived. The first came in a plain white envelope with no return address. The image was of a mountain range, sharp peaks rising against a purple sky. On the back, in the same uneven, familiar hand, were 6 words: "Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you." The second came from a desert, the third from a snowy forest. The fourth had no picture, only a blank card with the words, "Still walking, still grateful." Grace kept them all, pinned on a corkboard in the back of the quiet table's prep area. Sometimes she read them aloud to Tom. Sometimes she just held them, feeling the weight of presence across distance. Volunteers began to join them. First, a young woman named Carla, who had seen the wedding online and driven across 2 counties just to meet Grace. Then, a retired Marine who had once served under Colonel Brooks and recognized his name in a local newspaper article. Then more. Slowly, the quiet table became a movement, not in headlines or donations, but in hands, working, cooking, listening. They never accepted media requests. Grace declined every interview, every feature piece, every camera. "It's not about me," she always said. "It's about making people visible." The community shifted. Not entirely, not instantly. But faces that once turned away began to look differently at the rows of folding chairs and bowls of soup. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve one day and asked, "Can we eat here too?" And she said yes. One morning, just after the first snowfall dusted the sidewalks and rooftops, Grace arrived early to set up the heaters and check the pantry inventory. As she unlocked the gate and stepped inside, she froze. 12 men stood silently in the yard. Not seated, not waiting. Standing. Each wore civilian clothes, though the posture and discipline were unmistakable. At the front stood Captain Wallace, the same man who had spoken at her wedding, the photograph of his rescue forever etched in Grace's mind. He approached, extending a single white lily. "We'll be taking shifts volunteering here," he said simply. "This honor isn't one we'll allow to be forgotten." Grace took the flower without speaking. Her throat tightened too quickly for words. Behind him, the others stepped forward, each carrying a flower, each placing it on the long wooden counter where meals were served. 12 lilies silent and luminous against the aged wood. Tom arrived minutes later and stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "They showed up at dawn," he whispered. Grace nodded, her voice finally returning. "They understand," she said. That day, they served 63 people. On the wall above the serving counter, Grace had framed one item. It wasn't the medal, it wasn't a photo, it was the napkin. Yellowed slightly with age, creased from years in her wallet, it still bore the faded, shaken words, "Thank you for seeing me." Below it, in her own handwriting, she had added, "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." On the hardest mornings, when the soup burned or the volunteers didn't come or someone screamed at her from a passing car, Grace would touch that frame lightly and remember, not because she needed validation, but because the world was filled with people like the Colonel, like the girl with dirt on her knees, like the woman who had once been a nurse in a war she never asked to fight, people who had been ignored, overlooked, abandoned. She had no intention of saving them, only of seeing them, of sitting beside them, of saying, without words, again and again, "You are not invisible. You matter. You are home." If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. You won't want to miss them. And if this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it.